Thank you. Thank you very much. All right, good morning. It is great to be back here with GCA. It's been a little while since I've been back, so if you remember from the last time that I was here, we spent some time looking at the account of Joseph's life in the Old Testament book of Genesis. Wonderful. So, when we last got together, we looked at an event that would go on to have a monumental effect in Joseph's life from Genesis chapter 41. That something, if you recall, had to do with the Egyptian leader named Pharaoh, and it started with two dreams. And Pharaoh's first dream, if you remember, 7 healthy, good-looking cows were eaten by 7 ugly, skinny cows that came up out of the Nile River. In Pharaoh's second dream, 7 healthy heads of grain came up on one stalk, followed by 7 thin, blighted heads of grain that devoured them. Now, I am sure that Pharaoh was relieved to find out that this was only a dream, but those images probably seemed a whole lot more disturbing to him than anything that he may have experienced during a typical nightmare. Here's why. The Nile River, livestock, agricultural production, they all represented very important parts of the Egyptian economy back in those days, and all of them played a major role in these dreams. So Pharaoh felt, these dreams, maybe they have a deeper meaning. So he decided to look for some help in understanding and interpreting what they meant. And the first guys he went to were the Egyptians, the wise men and the magicians of Egypt. Genesis chapter 41, verse 8 says, Pharaoh told him his dreams, but no one could interpret them for Pharaoh. Now, we're going to find out later on, if you remember from last time, that these dreams were actually warning messages from God. And they were designed to help the king prepare for what was going to happen in the future. And even though Pharaoh's magicians and wise men, his counselors, even though those guys were supposed to be very highly skilled in answering such questions, there was a reason why they could not answer this one. The fact that these dreams were warning messages from God, that helps explain why Pharaoh's entire team of advisors failed to interpret the meaning of his dreams. Those fortune tellers, those wise men, they were trying to understand and interpret a message from God without any knowledge or understanding of him. So, no one could interpret Pharaoh's dreams. But then just the solution began to kind of percolate up from the distant memories of one particular individual. Verse 12 of Genesis chapter 41. Then the chief butler spoke to Pharaoh, saying, there was a young Hebrew man who was there with us in prison, a servant of the captain of the guard. And we told him, and he interpreted our dreams for us. So Joseph was hauled out of prison and taken to meet the most important person in the most powerful nation of the world at that time. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I've had a dream, and there is no one who can interpret it, but I have heard it said of you that you can understand a dream to interpret it. So Joseph answered Pharaoh, saying, it's not in me. God will give Pharaoh an answer of peace. Very important. The fate of as we're going to see, the fate of a multitude of nations is going to ride on Joseph's God-given ability to interpret the meaning and the message behind Pharaoh's dreams. Here's how he responded. This is where we left off last time. This is Joseph speaking here. God has revealed to Pharaoh in advance what he is about to do. The next 7 years will be a period of great prosperity throughout the land of Egypt. But afterward, there will be 7 years of famine so great that all the prosperity will be forgotten in Egypt. Famine will destroy the land. This famine will be so severe that even the memory of the good years will be erased. So, Joseph told Pharaoh that each of his dreams were each pointing to the same event. 7 years of great, abundant crops, followed by 7 years of drought and devastating famine. But notice that Joseph also made sure to say something else. He said, God has told you what he is going to do. In other words, Joseph made sure to let Pharaoh know that God had been gracious enough to give him some inside information about what was going to happen in the future. The next 7 years, arrow's going to point straight up, man. Plenty of crops, plenty to eat. The following 7 years, that's when the arrow starts going down. The following 7 years would be so bad that everybody would forget how great things were in the first 7 years. So the meaning behind Joseph's message was clear. The 7-year drought was going to wipe everything out. And the dream was repeated to Pharaoh twice because the thing is established by God, and God will shortly bring it to pass. So Genesis chapter 41, verse 32 tells us that Joseph wanted to communicate two important things through this message. First, Joseph wanted Pharaoh to clearly understand that these events, they were a done deal. They were sure to happen. God has definitely decided to do this. And next, there was a strong sense of urgency behind these messages. God is going to do it soon. So, notice here, Joseph explained the complete meaning of Pharaoh's dreams in just 9 sentences. But notice also that Joseph also made sure to mention God 4 times within those 9 sentences as well. And because of this, we know and we can say that Joseph was not somebody who wanted to take credit for giving Pharaoh the information he was looking for. Instead, Joseph made certain to focus on God and give him the recognition that he deserved in providing Pharaoh with the information that he was looking for. But, Joseph just didn't drop off his message and then leave. He also followed up with a suggestion that would help Pharaoh prepare for the future that was going to unfold as a result of these dreams. Verse 33. Joseph says, "Now, therefore, let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh do this and let him appoint officers over the land to collect 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt in the 7 plentiful years. And let them gather all the food of those good years that are coming and store up grain under the authority of Pharaoh, and let them keep food in the cities. Then that food shall be as a reserve for the land for the 7 years of famine, which shall be in the land of Egypt, that the land may not perish during the famine." So Joseph looks at the situation and he gives Pharaoh a suggested plan of action based on the information that God provided. And Joseph's idea was, hey, look, let's put a qualified person in charge of a plan to collect 20% of all the food that's going to be harvested over the next 7 years. That collected food would then be stored away for use later on, and that would provide everyone in the country with enough food to survive until the famine was over. Now, the idea behind this recommendation to Pharaoh was very simple. Look, you can prepare for the future by planning for it in the present. If Pharaoh really believed that Joseph had the right interpretation regarding his dreams, then he would be wise to start preparing for it right away. Now, I want to camp on this for a little bit because I think this is really important and it's applicable for today. This idea is just as true today as it was back in Joseph's day. Whatever somebody believes about the future is sure to influence the way that he or she lives in the present. Why is that? I'm glad you asked that question. That's because our beliefs are usually the deciding factor when it comes to making the choices we have to make in many different areas of life. Let me give you an illustration. Okay. Let's take the example of someone who believes that this life that we're leading right now, our physical life right now, that's all there is to our existence. When people die, that's it. It's over for them. They just go off into nothing. Okay? Since our beliefs help influence our actions, you can be sure that a person like this will tend to make life choices based on that belief, even if they don't consciously realize it. For instance, let me give you an example. Let's say a person, you believe that when you die, you just go off into nothingness. This life is all you've got. Well, you know what? You may not have much of an issue with various ethical concerns. Why? Because your beliefs may lead you to conclude, look, it doesn't really matter what you do now because you only live once. Why should I not lie if it benefits me? Why should I not steal if it benefits me? Why shouldn't I just do whatever is good for me and forget about it, what's good for everybody else? I mean, you only live once, right? Do you see how that mindset can influence your choices and your decisions? Now let's take an opposite example. Okay? Let's take the example of someone who believes in the existence of an afterlife, like the scriptures teach. Let's say we have someone who believes that everyone will eventually have to explain their thoughts and their actions to a totally perfect, totally holy, totally just God when they depart and pass from this life. Well, like the first person, in our first example, this person, he or she, will also make choices based on those beliefs, even if he or she doesn't consciously realize it. However, the person in this second example is likely to make some very different choices than the person in our first example. Why? Because what you believe helps determine what you will do. What you believe about the future should impact the way that you act and live here and now. So Joseph advised Pharaoh, hey, put somebody in charge of planning for the future foretold by your dreams. And as it turned out, hey, Pharaoh liked what he heard. So the advice was good in the eyes of Pharaoh and in the eyes of all his servants. Now, admittedly, there's a lot that has changed in 3,000 years. But, some things haven't really changed a whole lot. Here's one of them, I think. Remember, Pharaoh was a king. But even though Pharaoh was a king, he still held a political office. And what did that mean? It meant that as a politician, Pharaoh had to be concerned about all the kinds of stuff that politicians are concerned about. And one of the things that he probably had to think about was this. If the people of Egypt start getting used to the prosperity and abundance of the next 7 years, what's going to happen when the following 7 years of famine arrive? Well, that might cause the people to suddenly turn against me. They might suddenly begin to think that the gods are against me. Remember, we'll talk about this a little bit later on. Remember, the Egyptians were polytheists. They believed in the existence of many gods. Once those 7 years of famine come, maybe people start to think, you know what, the gods are angry with Pharaoh. If that happens, well, maybe they might try to get rid of me to appease the wrath of the gods, or so they believed. So for Pharaoh, there was a lot riding on this interpretation, and that potentially meant a matter of life and death for him. But while Pharaoh saw that Joseph had come up with a good plan, he also said something else that was important. Check this out. And Pharaoh said to his servants, can we find a man like this in whom is the Spirit of God? Notice, details are important. Notice that Pharaoh did not say Joseph is a god, nor did he say Joseph has the spirit of the gods within him. Instead, he basically said, look, Nobody can basically handle this better than Joseph, since the Spirit of God is with him. Now, you may not realize this, but this is the very first time in the Bible where it talks about the Spirit of God being with or within someone. This, I think it's a very significant statement coming from Pharaoh, a guy who believed in the existence of many gods. As a polytheist, I think this is a very significant statement coming from Pharaoh. It also, I think, says a lot about the way Joseph represented God to the king of Egypt. Pharaoh obviously saw that Joseph was a person of wisdom and a person of intelligence. But he also saw that God had provided him with the ability to supply the answers that he was looking for. Pharaoh also understood that Joseph had not taken the credit for himself, but placed the honor and the recognition for his ability where it really belonged, with God. So that tells me that Pharaoh believed and understood Joseph's underlying message. Look, I can't provide an interpretation for your dream, but God can give you the answer that you need. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Inasmuch as God has shown you all this, there is no one as discerning and wise as you. Therefore, you shall be over all my house, and all my people shall be ruled according to your word. Only in regard to the throne will I be greater than you." And Pharaoh said to Joseph, "See, I have set you over all the hand of Egypt." If we wanted to rephrase Pharaoh's response, we might understand his meaning to be something like this. Look, since God has given you all this advanced information, and you've got this great plan, you know what? I'm just going to let you run everything. And that meant that Joseph would now be put in charge of the entire nation. The only person with more power and more authority than Joseph would be Pharaoh himself. But let me point something out to you here. This must have seemed like a great idea to Pharaoh and everybody else in Egypt. Joseph, Joseph's going to save the country. Yeah, God gave Joseph the meaning of his dreams. Everybody's going to have plenty to eat and famine. Go, Joseph, Joseph. There was one person that I can think of in the nation of Egypt who was almost certainly not happy to hear about Joseph's promotion. Can any of you guess who might not be very happy about Joseph's promotion? Young lady here in the front, what you got? Who? Nice and loud so everybody can hear your answer, please. We have a winner. Congratulations. Nicely done. Why? Let me ask you here. Let me ask you for a moment. Okay? Why do you think Mrs. Potiphar would not be very happy about this? So she said because she got him in prison and now he was promoted. I agree with that 100%. You remember Mrs. Potiphar, don't you? The person who falsely accused Joseph of a sexual assault, the person who wrecked Joseph's reputation, the person who was directly responsible for getting him thrown in jail for 2 years. How do you think Mrs. Potiphar reacted when she heard the news that Joseph was now the second most powerful guy in the whole country? Do you think it's possible that she may have thought, you know what, man? This is Joseph's chance to get back at me. But you notice something interesting? The scriptures never tell us that Joseph, or even try to suggest that Joseph tried to take revenge on Mrs. Potiphar for what she had done. You know, maybe Joseph knew something that God would later inspire another biblical author to write in the New Testament book of Romans. This is Romans chapter 2, verse 19. Do not take revenge, my friends, but leave room for God's wrath. For it is written, it is mine to avenge, I will repay, says the Lord. Then Pharaoh took his signet ring off his hand and put it on Joseph's hand. And he clothed him in garments of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. And he had him ride in the second chariot which he had. And they cried out before him, bow the knee. So he set him over all the land of Egypt. Pharaoh also said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without your consent, no man may lift his hand or foot in all of Egypt. So let me try to interpret this in a more modern day context. These verses tell us that Pharaoh gave Joseph some important items to support his new authority. First, we're told that Pharaoh gave Joseph his personal signet ring. This was the ring that carried Pharaoh's identifying mark. If you want to think of it in these terms, Pharaoh's signet ring was kind of like a debit card. You have a debit card or you have a credit card, okay? It gave Joseph the ability to make any financial transaction that he might deem necessary. We're also told that Pharaoh gave Joseph a new wardrobe of fine linen, put a gold chain around his neck. What's the significance of that? Well, those items told everybody that Joseph was now a high-ranking government official. In fact, Pharaoh even provided Joseph with the ancient equivalent of his own personal limo. It says he gave him the second royal chariot to ride in. Now, before we continue, let me stop here for a minute. It's possible, you may be sitting out there saying, wait, time out. Wait, do you really expect me to believe that Joseph suddenly went from being imprisoned in a dungeon to becoming the second most powerful person in the entire nation, and all because he interpreted somebody's dream? Well, yeah, I do expect you to believe that. Here's why. Joseph's promotion was not based on who he was or where he came from. It was based on Pharaoh's recognition of the God who was the driving force behind his ability to interpret the meaning of his dreams. We saw this when Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has made all this known to you, there is no one as discerning and as wise as you. So Joseph was given this position because he was the best qualified guy to do the job. And why did he receive that qualification? He received that qualification because God had given him his spirit and made him both wise and discerning. That's why it didn't matter who Joseph was. It didn't matter where Joseph came from. God was the one who was with him, and Pharaoh recognized it. I think that's highly applicable for our lives today. However, there were a few social and political realities that had to be sorted out before Joseph could start his new job. I'm going to see this guy again in a little while. Genesis chapter 41, verse 35, and Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphnath-Paneah, and he gave him as a wife Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On. So Joseph went out over all the land of Egypt. It seems, remember, Pharaoh's a king, but what was he also? He was also a politician. And it seems that Pharaoh had to deal with a couple of political realities before he installed Joseph in his new position. And one of those political realities was the possibility that his subjects might not want to accept an outsider like Joseph in a position of authority like this. So, to smooth things over, Pharaoh gives Joseph a new name, Zaphnath-Paneah. We're not really sure what that name means. Some scholar types think it means something like the man to whom secrets are revealed, or the savior of the nation, something like that. In any event, that new name would help Pharaoh represent Joseph as an immigrant who was now a citizen of Egypt. Next, Pharaoh provided Joseph with a wife from a level of society that was appropriate for a high-ranking government official. Her name was Asenath, and she was the daughter of a guy named Potiphar. The name Potiphar means he whom Ra has given. Ra was a sun god that was worshipped in Egypt at that time. If you remember Potiphar from earlier in our look at Joseph's life, Potiphar's name is a similar variation. Now, if your only understanding of Asenath comes from Joseph, king of dreams, I want you to put that idea out of your mind. This is the real deal regarding Asenath. It might seem wrong for somebody to accept Asenath as a marriage partner. Why? Her father was a priest in a false religion. She apparently didn't know anything about God, or Joseph for that matter. And with these things in mind, it might seem like this relationship was kind of a bad idea from the start. I mean, what is your youth pastor always telling you? Your youth pastor, your pastor, your Sunday school teacher, what are they always telling you? Don't date people who don't share your faith. Don't be unequally yoked. Don't be unequally yoked. Don't date non-believers, right? But here's Joseph apparently kind of doing the same thing, right? Well, not so fast. Just because Asenath's father was a priest in a pagan religion didn't necessarily mean that she was a follower of that belief as well. She could have chosen a very different spiritual path. For example, I mean, to me at least, it doesn't seem likely that Pharaoh would set Joseph up in a relationship with somebody who was opposed to his beliefs. To me, it also seems very doubtful that Joseph would have accepted Asenath if she had been someone who was likely to damage his relationship with God. After all, here's that guy again. After all, if Joseph could say no to somebody like Mrs. Potiphar, right, then he certainly could have done the same thing with Asenath if he wanted to. But here's the thing. If Asenath was someone who was willing to separate from her family's pagan beliefs and start a new life with Joseph, then it's easier to understand why Pharaoh selected her as a marriage partner for Joseph. And it's also easier to understand why Joseph would accept her. Genesis chapter 41, verse 6. Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went throughout all the land of Egypt. So Joseph, just 30 years old, not that old, man, when he became the second in command for the entire nation of Egypt. But remember, Joseph had been in Egypt since he was 17 years old, and that meant he hadn't seen his family for 13 years, and that is something, put that in your memory bank for later on. So Joseph took up his new position, got right to work. We know this because this passage tells us Joseph went out over the land of Egypt. So Joseph goes out on a scouting mission, and that probably included things like checking out the nation's agricultural production, picking out storage areas, setting up local collection and storage managers, making sure that everybody was prepared for what was coming. And so even though 7 years sounds like a really long time, Joseph knew there was a lot to do and there was no time to waste. Now in the 7 plentiful years, the ground brought forth abundantly. So he gathered up all the food of the 7 years, which were in the land of Egypt, and laid up the food in the cities. He laid up in every city the food of the fields which surrounded them. Joseph gathered very much grain as the sand of the sea, until he stopped counting, for it was immeasurable. So things happened just like God told him they would. Just as God had revealed to Joseph, the nation's agricultural production increased tremendously in the 7 years following Pharaoh's dream. And there was Joseph, man, collecting, storing, keeping records of how much food was on hand until he just couldn't do it anymore. All right, I got enough time just to do this one last thing. Verses 50 and 52. To Joseph were born 2 sons before the years of famine who came, whom Asenath, daughter of Potiphar, priest of On, bore to him. Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh, for God made me forget all my toil and all my father's house. And the name of the second he called Ephraim, for God has caused me to be fruitful in the land of my affliction. Joseph's firstborn son His name is Manasseh, a name that means making to forget. And the idea behind his name is that his birth made Joseph forget all the pain and all the sorrow that he'd experienced throughout the previous years. Joseph then had another son. His name was Ephraim. Ephraim's name meant fruitfulness, and his name recognized the great blessings that God had provided for Joseph and his family. Now, it may not be very obvious if you're reading this today, but Ephraim and Manasseh, they were not Egyptian names. They were Hebrew names. And it was very unlikely to find somebody in Egyptian society, especially at that level, who had names like this. Now, it may have been unusual to find somebody with a name like this in high-ranking Egyptian culture, but I think there's a reason to explain why Joseph chose these names. These names were designed to serve as a witness to God's provision in Joseph's life. Manasseh's name helped remind everyone that God had been faithful to make his father forget all the wrong things that had been done to him. Ephraim's name demonstrated that his father recognized all the great blessings that God had given to him while he was in Egypt. And that meant whenever someone asked one of Joseph's sons, that's kind of an unusual name. What does that name mean? Well, both of his sons had an opportunity to talk about God's blessings and God's faithfulness towards his father. Okay, so my time is up. Let me close with prayer, and then God willing, next month, when I have an opportunity to be with you again, we'll pick it up from this point and read ahead, because a certain family with 11 brothers are about to circle back into the story of Joseph's life. And what happens when they do so is very, very interesting.